The fluorescent lights of Meridian Corporate Tower buzzed like angry wasps, casting their harsh glare over polished marble floors that reflected nothing but contempt. In this gleaming monument to corporate success, where million-dollar deals were struck over artisanal coffee and executives discussed quarterly profits while their assistants scheduled spa appointments, nobody paid attention to the woman pushing the industrial cleaning cart down the 20th floor corridor. They should have. Maria Santos moved through these halls like a ghost, invisible to the suits who stepped around her without acknowledgement, their eyes sliding past her as if she were just another piece of furniture. At 43, she had the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard years and harder choices, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. Her navy blue janitor's uniform was clean but faded, the fabric soft from countless washings, and her steel-toed boots made barely a whisper against the expensive flooring as she methodically emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The 21st floor housed Meridian Defense Consulting, one of the most prestigious military contracting firms in the country. This was where former generals became millionaires, where classified contracts were negotiated over crystal decanters of bourbon, and where the distance between civilian comfort and military sacrifice was measured in stock options and performance bonuses. The employees here wore their connections to the defense industry like designer accessories, name-dropping classified projects, and Pentagon contacts with the casual arrogance of people who believed proximity to power made them powerful. Maria had been cleaning these floors for 18 months, arriving each evening at 6 p.m. when the executives were heading home to their suburban mansions and imported cars. She worked the night shift because it paid a premium, because it meant fewer people to navigate around, and because darkness had always been her friend. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her nights maintaining the offices of people who discussed military strategy like a board game, their understanding of warfare filtered through PowerPoint presentations and budget projections rather than the brutal reality of sand, blood, and the weight of responsibility that came with life and death decisions. The hallway she walked down was lined with photographs of corporate leadership posing with various military officials, their smiles frozen in moments of manufactured camaraderie. Bronze plaques commemorated contracts won and projects completed, each representing millions in revenue generated from America's foreign conflicts. Glass cases displayed military memorabilia that had been purchased at auctions rather than earned through service, and motivational posters featuring images of tanks and aircraft served as inspiration for people who had never heard a shot fired. In anger, tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed to pulse through the building's ventilation system. Tomorrow, Meridian Defense was hosting a major presentation for a new Pentagon contract, worth close to $2 billion. The contract involved advanced battlefield communication systems, the kind of technology that could mean the difference between coordinated military operations and chaos in the field. Representatives from every branch of the military would be in attendance, including several high-ranking generals who rarely left the Pentagon for civilian meetings. The preparation had been going on for weeks. Conference rooms had been reconfigured with state-of-the-art presentation equipment. Catering had been arranged from the city's most exclusive restaurants. Security protocols had been reviewed and enhanced. The entire 20th and 21st floors had been transformed into a showcase designed to impress military leadership and secure a contract that would define Meridian's future for the next decade. But success had made the company's employees careless. With triumph seemingly assured and bonuses already being calculated, the usual professional courtesy had given way to something uglier. The janitor had become a convenient target for stress relief, a visible reminder of their own superiority in the corporate hierarchy. What had started as casual dismissal had evolved into something more deliberate, more cruel. It began with Jake Morrison, a 32-year-old project manager, who wore expensive suits to compensate for his complete lack of actual military experience. He had discovered that making comments about the cleaning lady's appearance and work ethic earned him laughs from his colleagues during their after-work drinks. His jokes about upgrading the cleaning staff to someone who actually speaks English and suggestions that Maria was probably too stupid to understand what kind of important work happens here had become a regular part of his routine. Linda Rodriguez, the office coordinator, had joined in with her own brand of passive-aggressive harassment. She made a point of inspecting Maria's work with exaggerated scrutiny, loudly declaring areas that needed to be cleaned again while her coworkers watched. She would deliberately schedule meetings in conference rooms, just as Maria arrived to clean them, then act irritated when asked to move. Her favorite trick was leaving personal messes in the break room, then expressing shock and disappointment when Maria had to clean them up. David Chen, a former military contractor who had never served, but wore his civilian Pentagon connections like a badge of honor, contributed his own form of intimidation. He would follow Maria around during his late-night work sessions, making loud phone calls about security concerns and the need to monitor unauthorized personnel more closely. He took particular pleasure in reminding her that she was replaceable, that there were plenty of people who would appreciate having her job, and that her employment depended entirely on the goodwill of people like him. The harassment had escalated over the past month as the pressure of the upcoming presentation increased. What started as occasional comments had become a daily ritual of humiliation. They would time their bathroom breaks to coincide with her cleaning schedule, then complain about the smell of cleaning chemicals. They would hold loud conversations about immigration policy whenever she was within earshot, making sure their opinions about certain types of people were clearly communicated. They would leave deliberately excessive messes in their offices, then criticize her attention to detail when she took extra time to clean them properly. Maria endured it all with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. She never responded to their comments, never defended herself against their accusations, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply did her job with the methodical precision that had become her trademark, cleaning each surface as if her life depended on it, maintaining standards that exceeded anything the company required. But there were moments, late at night, when the building was empty except for the security guards and the hum of climate control systems, when Maria would pause in her work and stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. In those moments, something flickered behind her eyes, a depth that didn't match the simple uniform or the humble posture. It was the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone, and carried secrets that were too heavy for casual conversation. The other employees at Meridian Defense saw only what they expected to see: a middle-aged woman with limited options and fewer opportunities, grateful for any job that paid the bills and kept her invisible to the world. They saw someone who cleaned up their messes because she had no choice, someone who accepted their treatment because she knew her place in the hierarchy. They saw a janitor. They didn't see the way she automatically checked exit routes whenever she entered a new room. They didn't notice how she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with doorways and windows. They missed the subtle way she cataloged potential threats and defensive positions even while emptying trash cans and mopping floors. They couldn't recognize the muscle memory that guided her movements, the economy of motion that came from years of operating in environments where efficiency meant survival. Most importantly, they didn't see the small tattoo hidden beneath the collar of her uniform, concealed by careful positioning and strategic clothing choices. It was barely visible even when she changed clothes in the employee locker room, a small mark that most people would dismiss as decorative body art if they noticed it at all. But to those who knew what to look for, that tattoo told a story that would have changed everything about how Maria Santos was perceived and treated. The design was simple but unmistakable to anyone familiar with military insignia. A small eagle perched atop a globe and anchor, with 3 subtle stars arranged beneath it. Below that, in letters so small they were almost microscopic, were the words that would have stopped every conversation in the building: Semper Fidelis, and a number that corresponded to one of the most classified military units in American history. Tomorrow's presentation would bring together military leadership from across the Pentagon, including generals who had spent their careers in the shadowy world of special operations. These were men and women who understood that real military capability often came from the most unexpected places, who had learned to recognize excellence regardless of how it was packaged. They were coming to Meridian Defense to evaluate the company's technological capabilities, but they would discover something far more significant. They would discover that the woman their hosts had been treating like garbage-possessed credentials. That made everyone else in the building look like amateurs playing dress-up. They would learn that the quiet janitor who endured daily humiliation had earned respect from the highest levels of military command through actions that couldn't be discussed in civilian company. And they would demonstrate exactly what happened when real military leadership encountered someone whose service demanded recognition, regardless of their current circumstances. But for now, Maria Santos continued her rounds, her cart squeaking softly as she moved from office to office. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would transform everything about how this building operated. Tonight, she was still just the janitor they bullied, carrying secrets they couldn't imagine, and maintaining dignity they couldn't break. The fluorescent lights continued their angry buzzing overhead, casting the same harsh shadows they had for 18 months. But something in the air suggested that tomorrow's light would illuminate truths that had been hidden too long in darkness. The morning sun painted Denver's skyline in shades of gold and amber as Maria Santos stepped off the city bus at 5th and Broadway, her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder and her work uniform pressed despite its age. She had been riding this same route for 18 months, watching the city wake up through scratched bus windows while office workers scrolled through their phones and construction crews headed to job sites across the metropolitan area. Unlike the other passengers who chatted about weekend plans or complained about Monday morning traffic, Maria rode in silence, her dark eyes taking in details that others missed entirely. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better decades, the kind of place where the rent was affordable because the neighborhood was still transitioning and the amenities consisted mainly of functioning plumbing and reliable electricity. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' television programs and telephone conversations. But Maria had learned long ago how to find quiet spaces in her own mind when the outside world became too intrusive. Her furniture was minimal and practical. A small dining table that doubled as a desk, a couch that had been purchased secondhand but was meticulously maintained, and a bed with military-precise hospital corners that never varied from one day to the next. Only decoration in her living space was a single framed photograph on the narrow windowsill, positioned to catch the morning light. It showed 5 people in desert camouflage uniforms standing beside a military vehicle, their faces partially obscured by tactical sunglasses and the harsh shadows of an unforgiving sun. The landscape behind them was pure desolation, all sand and rock and endless blue sky, the kind of terrain that existed in places most Americans could never locate on a map. Maria was in the center of the group, younger than, her hair shorter and her face bearing the lean intensity of someone who had learned to make split-second decisions under impossible pressure. She never looked at the photograph directly when she was getting ready for work, but its presence seemed to anchor her morning routine in something larger than the day-to-day reality of cleaning supplies and time clocks. Her preparation was methodical and precise: shower, coffee, inspection of her uniform for any imperfections that might draw unwanted attention. She had learned that being invisible required perfection in the details, that people noticed janitors only when something was wrong with their appearance or their work. The walk from the bus stop to Meridian Defense Consulting took exactly 12 minutes at a steady pace, long enough for her to mentally prepare for another day of systematic humiliation, disguised as workplace hierarchy. She arrived at the employee entrance promptly at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before her official start time, because punctuality was one of the few forms of dignity she could maintain in her current circumstances. The loading dock area where service employees entered was a stark contrast to the marble and glass lobby where executives and clients were welcomed, with concrete floors stained by years of deliveries and fluorescent fixtures that cast everything in an unforgiving industrial glare. Margaret Wallace, the day shift supervisor, was already waiting with her clipboard and the kind of expression that suggested she had been looking forward to this conversation. At 58, Margaret had worked her way up from entry-level positions to minor authority through a combination of unwavering loyalty to company policies and an acute understanding of exactly how much power she could exercise over people who had fewer options than she did. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun that matched her tight lips, and her company blazer was worn like armor against any suggestion that she might sympathize with the people she supervised. "Santos," she called out as Maria approached. The time clock, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Need to speak with you before you start today." Maria stopped and turned, her expression neutral but alert. In 18 months of employment, Margaret had never needed to speak with her about anything other than schedule changes or new cleaning protocols. This felt different, charged with the kind of tension that preceded bad news or worse accusations. "There's been some complaints," Margaret continued, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision, "about your attitude lately. Some of the professional staff have mentioned that you seem unresponsive when they try to interact with you." The accusation was so perfectly crafted that Maria almost admired its construction. Unresponsive suggested defiance without requiring proof of actual misbehavior. It turned her refusal to engage with harassment into a character flaw, transforming her dignity into evidence of poor customer service. It was the kind of complaint that was impossible to defend against, because it was subjective, unmeasurable, and ultimately unprovable in either direction. "I complete my assigned duties according to company standards," Maria replied, her voice steady and professional. "I maintain required cleaning schedules and respond appropriately to legitimate work-related requests." Margaret's smile was thin and sharp, the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly that response. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That tone, that attitude. Our professional staff shouldn't have to deal with hostility from service personnel." Behind Margaret, Jake Morrison emerged from the elevator bank, his expensive suit crisp despite the early hour and his smartphone already pressed to his ear in an animated conversation about quarterly projections and market positioning. He noticed the conversation at the time clock and altered his path slightly, bringing himself close enough to overhear while maintaining the pretense of being absorbed in his call. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly to ensure Jake could hear every word, "there have been concerns about your work quality. Mr. Morrison specifically mentioned that his office hasn't been meeting standards lately." Jake ended his phone call with exaggerated timing and approached the group with the confident stride of someone who knew he held all the cards in this particular game. His smile was practiced and professional, the kind he used in client meetings when he needed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. "Morning, Margaret," he said, nodding to the supervisor before turning his attention to Maria with barely concealed contempt. "Hope we're addressing those quality control issues we discussed." Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained level. "My cleaning procedures follow all company protocols. If there are specific areas of concern, I can address them." Jake laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls of the loading dock with particular cruelty. Specific areas of concern? How about basic competence? How about understanding that when executives are working late on critical projects, they shouldn't have to worry about whether their offices will be properly maintained? The accusation was particularly galling because Maria knew her work was flawless. She took pride in maintaining standards that exceeded anything required by the company's service contracts. Her cleaning was thorough, systematic, and completed with the kind of attention to detail that most people associated with far more prestigious occupations. Jake's complaints weren't about quality. They were about power, about the pleasure he derived from making someone he perceived as powerless squirm under false accusations. "I've never received any specific feedback about deficiencies in my work," Maria said, her tone carefully controlled. "If there are areas that need improvement, I'm willing to address them." Linda Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive for her. Early meeting preparation, her heels clicking against the concrete with staccato precision. She carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had learned that attacking others was the best defense against her own insecurities. And her perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite conceal the calculating look in her eyes as she assessed the situation. "Oh good," Linda said, joining the circle with obvious satisfaction. "Are we finally dealing with the attitude problem? Because I have to say, it's been affecting office morale for weeks." The lie was delivered with such conviction that Maria might have believed it herself if she hadn't known better. Office morale among the executives was at an all-time high, buoyed by anticipation of the major contract presentation and the bonuses that would follow a successful outcome. The only morale problem was the one created by their systematic harassment of someone they perceived as an easy target. David Chen appeared from the stairwell, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He had clearly been waiting for this confrontation, savoring the opportunity to participate in what he undoubtedly saw as a justified correction of workplace hierarchy. His civilian clothes were carefully chosen to suggest military bearing without actually claiming service, and his bearing had the studied aggression of someone who had never been tested in any meaningful way. "About time," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed himself judge and jury. "I've been documenting performance issues for weeks. Unprofessional behavior, failure to follow direct instructions, general insubordination." Each accusation was more outrageous than the last, but Maria recognized the strategy behind them. They were creating a paper trail, building a case that would justify whatever punishment they had already decided to impose. This wasn't about her performance or her attitude. This was about establishing their power to destroy someone who couldn't fight back through conventional channels. Margaret consulted her clipboard again, clearly enjoying her role as the official voice of corporate authority. "Given the pattern of complaints and the upcoming client presentation, I'm issuing a formal written warning. Any further issues will result in immediate termination." She produced a prepared document, its legal language carefully crafted to protect the company while providing maximum latitude for future disciplinary action. The warning cited vague performance issues and attitude problems without specifying any concrete examples that could be disputed or defended against. It was a masterpiece of corporate persecution, designed to create a permanent mark on Maria's employment record while maintaining the fiction that the company was being reasonable and fair. "You need to sign this acknowledgement that you've received." "The warning," Margaret said, extending a pen with obvious satisfaction. "And understand that we'll be monitoring your performance very closely going forward." Maria looked at the document, reading its contents with the careful attention of someone who understood that words could be weapons when wielded by people with power. Every paragraph was designed to strip away her dignity while protecting her tormentors from any consequences for their behavior. It was humiliation disguised as human resources policy, persecution wrapped in the language of performance management. Jake crossed his arms and smiled with unconcealed pleasure. Just sign it and we can all get back to doing important work. Some of us have a major presentation to prepare for, and we can't afford any distractions from the cleaning staff." Linda nodded enthusiastically, her expression suggesting she was already planning to share this story with her colleagues as an example of proper management technique. "Exactly. We need people who understand their role here and can perform their duties without causing problems for the professional staff." David added his own commentary with the confidence of someone who believed he was delivering wisdom rather than cruelty. "This is a business, not a charity. Everyone needs to pull their weight and maintain appropriate professional standards." The group stood in a loose circle around Maria, their body language radiating satisfaction and superiority. They had successfully cornered their target, created official documentation of her deficiencies, and established their authority to control her employment future. In their minds, this was justice, a reminder to someone who had forgotten her place in the corporate hierarchy. Maria took the pen and signed the document without comment, her signature precise and unhurried despite the circumstances. She understood that resistance at this moment would only provide them with additional ammunition for future harassment. Sometimes survival required strategic retreat, even when retreat felt like surrender. "Good," Margaret said, retrieving the signed document with obvious satisfaction. "Now let's hope we don't have any more issues going forward. Clock in and get started on your duties. And remember, we'll be watching." As the group dispersed to their various offices and meetings, Maria stood alone at the time clock, the hum of fluorescent lights and ventilation systems, the only sounds in the loading dock area. She had endured worse humiliation in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than paychecks, but this felt different somehow. This was personal in a way that combat never was, targeted and deliberate rather than simply the random cruelty of circumstance. She clocked in precisely at 6 a.m. and gathered her cleaning supplies from the storage closet, beginning another day of maintaining spaces for people who had just demonstrated their complete lack of respect for her humanity. But as she loaded her cart and prepared to navigate the marble corridors of corporate success, something had shifted in her bearing. The patience that had seemed infinite now had boundaries, and those boundaries were being tested by people who had no idea how dangerous it was to mistake dignity for weakness. Tomorrow would bring the presentation that everyone was so excited about, along with military leadership who understood the difference between genuine authority and corporate posturing. Maria Santos had 18 months of accumulated grievances and a lifetime of training in how to handle people who mistook uniforms for character. The reckoning was coming, and it would arrive wearing stars on its shoulders and carrying the weight of real authority. The executive conference room on the 21st floor had been transformed into a theater of corporate ambition, its mahogany table polished to mirror brightness and surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Florida's ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Denver's downtown skyline, while integrated audiovisual systems promised seamless presentations to impress the most demanding clients. This morning, it would host the most important meeting in Meridian Defense Consulting's 15-year history, a presentation that would either secure their future or destroy their reputation in the defense contracting community. General Patricia Hawkins arrived at precisely 0800 hours, her staff car pulling up to the building's main entrance with the kind of military precision that civilian executives could only attempt to imitate. At 54, she commanded the Joint Special Operations Command, with an authority that had been earned through 3 decades of service in the world's most dangerous places. Her uniform was immaculate without being ostentatious, her bearing confident without being arrogant, and her reputation preceded her like a force of nature. When General Hawkins spoke, 4-star generals listened. When she walked into a room, everyone else instinctively straightened their posture. Behind her came General Marcus Rodriguez, whose weathered face bore the kind of scars that couldn't be earned in Pentagon briefing rooms. His silver star and purple heart ribbon spoke to combat service in places where heroism was measured in split-second decisions rather than quarterly reports. As head of Special Operations Training Command, he had spent his career identifying and developing the kind of warriors who operated in the shadows, completing missions that would never appear in official histories, but were essential to national security. The third member of the military delegation was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a rising star in intelligence operations whose rapid promotion through the ranks had raised eyebrows until her results silenced all critics. She possessed the kind of analytical mind that could synthesize complex information from multiple sources and identify patterns that others missed entirely. Her presence at this meeting suggested that Meridian Defense's proposed communication systems would be evaluated not just for their technical capabilities, but for their potential impact on classified operations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Richard Pemberton, Meridian Defense's CEO, greeted the military delegation with the kind of enthusiasm that barely concealed his desperation. At 62, he had built the company from a small consulting firm into a major defense contractor. But recent contract losses to competitors had left him vulnerable to a hostile takeover. This presentation represented more than just a business opportunity. It was his chance to prove that Meridian Defense still deserved a seat at the table where America's military future was decided. General Hawkins, General Rodriguez, Colonel Mitchell, Pemberton said, his handshake firm but slightly too aggressive. Welcome to Meridian Defense. We're honored to have the opportunity to demonstrate how our communication systems can revolutionize battlefield coordination. The generals responded with polite professionalism, but their expressions suggested they had attended hundreds of similar presentations and would evaluate this one based solely on its technical merits rather than corporate enthusiasm. They took their seats at the conference table while Pemberton's team made final adjustments to their presentation materials. Each slide carefully crafted to emphasize Meridian's capabilities while minimizing their recent failures. Jake Morrison stood at the front of the room, his expensive suit and confident demeanor masking the fact that his understanding of military communications was entirely theoretical. He had prepared for weeks, memorizing technical specifications and rehearsing responses to potential questions. But his knowledge came from textbooks and industry reports rather than actual battlefield experience. To him, military communications was about data transmission rates and encryption protocols, not about the life and death decisions that depended on reliable information in combat zones. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake began, his voice carrying the polished confidence of someone who had never been tested under real pressure. Today we're going to show you how Meridian Defense can provide the United States military with communication capabilities that will redefine what's possible in modern warfare. Linda Rodriguez operated the presentation system with theatrical precision, each slide transition timed to maximize dramatic impact. She had spent her career in corporate event management, creating impressive presentations for clients who valued style over substance, and she approached this meeting with the same philosophy. Her understanding of military operations was limited to what she had seen in Hollywood movies, but she knew how to make technical specifications look impressive on high-definition displays. David Chen provided technical commentary with the authority of someone who believed his civilian Pentagon connections qualified him as a military expert. He had never served in uniform, but he had attended countless briefings and absorbed enough jargon to speak convincingly about battlefield requirements to civilian audiences. His role was to bridge the gap between Meridian's corporate culture and military expectations. Though his understanding of both was superficial at best, the presentation proceeded with corporate efficiency, each speaker hitting their marks while colorful graphics illustrated theoretical capabilities and projected performance improvements. Charts showed data transmission speeds that would eliminate communication delays. Maps demonstrated coverage areas that would ensure connectivity in the most remote locations. Financial projections promised cost savings that would make Pentagon budget officers weep with gratitude. But General Hawkins was not impressed by charts and projections. She had seen too many presentations from companies that promised revolutionary capabilities, but delivered systems that failed under the stress of actual combat conditions. Her questions cut through the corporate rhetoric with surgical precision, focusing on real-world performance rather than theoretical specifications. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat, "your slides show impressive data transmission rates under laboratory conditions. What happens when your equipment is subjected to electromagnetic interference from enemy jamming systems?" Jake's rehearsed confidence faltered slightly as he realized that his preparation hadn't covered this specific scenario. "Well, General, our encryption protocols are designed to maintain signal integrity even under adverse conditions." "That's not what I asked," General Hawkins replied, her tone patient but firm. "I asked about electromagnetic interference, not encryption. If enemy forces are actively jamming your frequencies, how does your system maintain communication?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake glanced desperately at his colleagues, hoping someone would provide the technical expertise. He clearly lacked. Linda's presentation slides contained no information about jamming resistance, and David's Pentagon connections hadn't prepared him for questions about electronic warfare capabilities. General Rodriguez leaned forward, his scarred hands folded. "On the conference table, let me ask a different question. Your system promises real-time coordination between multiple units in a combat zone. What's your mean time between failure under combat stress?" Another uncomfortable silence. The corporate team had focused their preparation on selling the system's capabilities rather than acknowledging its limitations. They had assumed that impressive specifications would be sufficient to secure the contract, without considering that military leaders needed to understand exactly how systems would perform when lives depended on their reliability. Colonel Mitchell consulted her tablet, reviewing technical specifications with the kind of analytical attention that made corporate executives nervous. "I'm seeing claims about secure communication in contested environments, but no data about actual field testing. Has this system been deployed in any operational theaters?" Pemberton intervened, his desperation becoming more apparent as the presentation deteriorated. "Colonel, we've conducted extensive testing in controlled environments that simulate combat conditions. Our laboratory results demonstrate performance that exceeds current military standards." "Laboratory results," General Hawkins repeated, her tone suggesting that laboratory conditions bore little resemblance to the chaos of actual combat. "General Rodriguez, what's your assessment of laboratory testing versus field deployment?" General Rodriguez's smile was grim but not unkind. "In my experience, General, laboratory conditions are useful for initial development, but they can't replicate the stress of combat operations. Equipment that works perfectly in controlled environments often fails catastrophically when subjected to the variables of actual warfare." The corporate team exchanged worried glances as they realized their presentation was failing to convince their audience. Their impressive slides and confident delivery had been designed to impress civilian executives, not military leaders who understood the difference between theoretical capabilities and proven performance. They were drowning in questions they couldn't answer, exposed as amateurs playing in a professional arena. Jake made a desperate attempt to regain control of the presentation. "Generals, I think you'll find that our system's redundancy protocols ensure continued operation even if individual components fail under stress." "Walk me through those protocols," General Hawkins said, her request sounding more like a command. "Specifically, How does your system handle cascade failures when multiple components are compromised simultaneously? The question revealed the fundamental gap between corporate presentation and military reality. Jake's understanding of redundancy protocols was limited to what his engineering team had told him in preparation meetings, and they had focused on normal operational scenarios rather than worst-case combat conditions. His attempt to answer demonstrated his lack of genuine expertise in terms that were painfully obvious to everyone in the room. Colonel Mitchell interrupted his stumbling response with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Morrison, have you ever used military communication equipment in an operational environment?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jake's expensive suit and confident bearing couldn't disguise the fact that his understanding of military communications was entirely academic. He had never carried a radio in a combat zone, never experienced the life and death importance of reliable communication, never understood the weight of responsibility that came with providing equipment that soldiers would depend on in the field. "I have extensive experience in communication systems development," Jake replied, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "My background includes years of work with defense contractors and Pentagon liaisons." General Rodriguez's expression suggested he had heard similar qualifications from dozens of civilian contractors who confused proximity to the military with actual understanding of military needs. That's not what Colonel Mitchell asked. She asked if you had operational experience with the equipment you're proposing to sell us. The distinction was crucial, and everyone in the room understood its implications. There was a vast difference between selling military equipment and using it, between understanding specifications and understanding how those specifications translated to battlefield effectiveness. The corporate team's lack of operational experience was becoming more apparent with each question, undermining their credibility with military leaders who valued proven expertise over theoretical knowledge. Linda attempted to redirect the conversation back to their prepared presentation materials. "Generals, if we could return to our capability demonstration, I think you'll find that our system's performance metrics speak for themselves." General Hawkins' smile was polite but cold. "Ms. Rodriguez, performance metrics are useful, but they're meaningless without context. What we need to understand is how your system performs under the specific conditions our forces encounter in operational theaters." The corporate team was losing control of their own presentation, reduced to reactive responses rather than proactive demonstration of their capabilities. Their carefully rehearsed talking points were proving inadequate against questions that required deep understanding rather than superficial knowledge. They were being exposed as vendors rather than partners, people trying to sell equipment rather than solve military problems. Pemberton made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Generals, I think there may be some confusion about our development process. We've worked closely with retired military personnel to ensure our systems meet operational requirements." Colonel Mitchell looked up from her tablet with an expression that suggested she had just discovered something interesting. "Retired personnel. That's helpful for institutional knowledge, but what about current operational input? Do you have any active duty personnel involved in your development process?" The question revealed another gap in Meridian's approach. They had hired retired officers as consultants, valuing their military credentials over their current understanding of evolving battlefield requirements. Their development process was based on historical needs rather than contemporary challenges, making their systems potentially obsolete before they were even deployed. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes. But the damage was irreversible. Each question revealed another limitation in the corporate team's understanding, another gap between their claims and their capabilities. The military delegation maintained professional courtesy throughout, but their body language suggested they had already reached their conclusions about Meridian Defense's suitability as a contractor. As the formal presentation concluded, General Hawkins stood with the kind of decisive movement that suggested the meeting was over, regardless of what the corporate executives might have planned. "Mr. Pemberton, thank you for your time. We'll review your proposal and provide feedback through appropriate channels." The dismissal was polite but final, delivered with the authority of someone who had made similar decisions countless times before. The corporate team recognized that their presentation had failed, but they were powerless to change the outcome. Their lack of genuine military expertise had been exposed by leaders who understood the difference between selling weapons and using them. As the military delegation prepared to leave, none of them could have imagined that the most qualified person in the building was at that moment pushing a cleaning cart through the corridors below. Invisible to executives who had just demonstrated their complete lack of understanding about what real military service actually meant, the afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive break room, casting long shadows across expensive furniture that had been carefully selected to project an image of success and sophistication. The leather sofas and polished granite countertops created an atmosphere of corporate luxury, a stark contrast to the utilitarian employee areas where service staff took their breaks. This was a sanctuary for the professional class, a place where strategic decisions were made over artisanal coffee and imported pastries. Jake Morrison slouched in one of the leather chairs, his tie loosened and his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The disastrous presentation to the military delegation had left him feeling exposed and humiliated, his lack of genuine expertise revealed in ways that would follow him throughout his career. His smartphone lay forgotten on the glass coffee table, its screen dark because he couldn't bear to check the messages that were undoubtedly waiting from colleagues who had heard about the morning's failures. "I can't believe they ambushed us like that," he said, his voice carrying the petulant tone of someone who had expected praise but received criticism instead. Those questions were completely outside the scope of what we prepared for. Nobody told us they'd be asking about electromagnetic interference and cascade failures. Linda Rodriguez paced behind the counter, her heels clicking against the marble floor with agitated rhythm. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't conceal the stress lines around her eyes, and her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the morning's strain. She had built her reputation on flawless event management and seamless presentations, but the military leaders had treated her carefully crafted demonstration like amateur hour at a community college. "They were supposed to be impressed by our capabilities demonstration," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "Instead, they acted like we were trying to sell them children's toys." The general actually rolled her eyes when I showed the coverage area projections. David Chen sat at the granite counter, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision while staring out at the city skyline. His civilian Pentagon connections, which had seemed so valuable during the company's preparation phase, had proven worthless when confronted with leaders who could distinguish between proximity to power and actual expertise. The confident authority he usually projected had crumbled under questioning from people who understood the difference between talking about military operations and actually conducting them. "The whole thing was a setup," he declared, his voice carrying the bitter conviction of someone who needed to blame external forces rather than acknowledge personal inadequacy. "They came in here with their minds already made up, probably had their preferred contractor selected before they even walked through the door." The three executives had retreated to the break room immediately after the military delegation's departure, seeking refuge in familiar surroundings where they could process their humiliation without witnesses. Their colleagues had scattered to various offices and conference rooms, either genuinely busy with other projects or tactfully avoiding association with the morning's disaster. The building's usual energy felt subdued, as if the failure had infected the entire corporate culture. Jake picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone who might provide insight into what had gone wrong or how the situation might be salvaged. His network consisted primarily of other corporate executives and civilian Pentagon employees, people who shared his theoretical understanding of military affairs without any practical experience in the field. None of them would be able to explain why seasoned military leaders had been unimpressed by presentation slides and performance projections. "Maybe we should call Harrison at the Pentagon," Jake suggested, referring to a civilian procurement officer who had provided inside information about the contract requirements. "He might be able to tell us what they were really looking for." Linda stopped pacing and turned to face her colleagues, her expression suggesting she had been thinking along similar lines. "Or we could reach out to General Patterson's office. He's retired now, but he still has connections throughout the defense establishment. Maybe he could provide some perspective on what went wrong." The suggestion revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to their morning's humiliation. They were still thinking in terms of connections and insider information, as if their failure had been caused by inadequate preparation rather than genuine lack of expertise. They couldn't recognize that military leaders had evaluated them based on competence rather than credentials, substance rather than style. David's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and his face darkened as he read its contents. "Pemberton wants to see all of us in his office at 3 o'clock. Apparently, the Pentagon liaison called to provide preliminary feedback about our presentation." The three executives exchanged worried glances, understanding that preliminary feedback delivered within hours of a presentation was rarely positive. In the defense contracting world, successful meetings were followed by requests for additional information and scheduling of follow-up sessions. Immediate feedback usually meant immediate rejection, delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is unbelievable," Jake said, his frustration boiling over into anger. "We spend months preparing the most comprehensive presentation in company history, and they dismiss us after 2 hours because we don't have combat experience. Since when is operational deployment a requirement for system development?" His question revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about military procurement and the importance that operational leaders placed on proven expertise. In the corporate world, successful presentations were about persuasion and positioning, about creating compelling narratives that justified purchasing decisions. In the military world, procurement decisions were about life and death, about providing soldiers with equipment that would function reliably when their survival depended on it. Linda resumed her pacing, her agitation growing as she contemplated the implications of the morning's failure. "We need to figure out how to spin this. Maybe we can position it as a learning experience that will help us better understand military requirements. Turn the feedback into an opportunity for improvement." The suggestion demonstrated her background in corporate communications, where failures could be reframed as growth opportunities and setbacks could be transformed into evidence of commitment to excellence. But military procurement operated according to different rules, where proven capability mattered more than demonstrated improvement, and where second chances were rarely offered to contractors who had already revealed their limitations. David pushed back from the counter and walked to the windows, staring out at the city below while his colleagues continued their post-mortem analysis. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had built his career on the assumption that proximity to military affairs was equivalent to understanding them, and that assumption had been thoroughly destroyed by leaders who could recognize authentic expertise. "You know what really bothers me?" he said, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "The way they looked at us, like we were amateurs pretending to understand something beyond our comprehension. We're successful professionals with years of experience in defense contracting." Jake nodded emphatically, grateful to have his resentment validated by someone who shared his frustration. "Exactly. We're not some fly-by-night operation trying to cash in on military contracts. We've been doing this for years. We understand the industry." Their shared indignation created a sense of solidarity that helped them avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth that their years of experience had been in the wrong areas. They understood the business of defense contracting without understanding the purpose it served, the process of military procurement without comprehending needs it was designed to meet. They were experts in selling to the military without being competent in serving it. Linda's pacing brought her to the coffee station, where she poured herself another cup with hands that trembled slightly from stress and caffeine. The question now is how we recover from this. Pemberton isn't going to be happy about losing a $2 billion contract, especially after all the resources we invested in preparing for this presentation. The mention of their CEO's likely reaction cast a shadow over the already gloomy atmosphere. Richard Pemberton had built Meridian Defense through aggressive pursuit of major contracts, and his leadership style became increasingly demanding when the company faced setbacks. The loss of this contract wouldn't just represent missed revenue. It would signal to the defense establishment that Meridian lacked the credibility to compete for the most prestigious projects. Jake's phone rang, displaying Pemberton's direct line, and he stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. His conversation was brief and uncomfortable, consisting mainly of monosyllabic responses to questions he clearly didn't want to answer. When he hung up, his expression suggested the preliminary feedback had been even worse than expected. The Pentagon liaison used the word unimpressive, Jake reported, his voice hollow with disbelief. Apparently, General Hawkins specifically mentioned our lack of operational understanding and questioned whether we had the expertise necessary to develop reliable military communications equipment. The word unimpressive landed like a physical blow, particularly devastating because it was so understated. Military leaders were trained to provide diplomatic feedback even when delivering harsh criticism, which meant that unimpressive probably represented a polite translation of much harsher private assessments. The delegation had not merely rejected Meridian's proposal. They had questioned the company's fundamental competence. Linda set down her coffee cup with enough force to create a sharp crack against the granite counter. This is so unfair. We followed all the proper procedures. We met all the technical requirements. We presented a system that exceeded their stated specifications. How were we supposed to know they'd prioritize operational experience over engineering capability? Her protest revealed the gulf between civilian and military perspectives on procurement. In the corporate world, technical specifications were often treated as maximum requirements that could be met through engineering excellence and innovative design. In the military world, specifications were minimum requirements that had to be exceeded under the worst possible conditions by people whose lives depended on equipment reliability. David turned away from the windows with an expression of grim determination. We need to identify what went wrong and figure out how to address it. Maybe we can bring in some consultants with operational experience, former Special Forces personnel who can provide credibility for our next proposal. The suggestion demonstrated his continued misunderstanding of the morning's lessons. He was still thinking in terms of credentials and appearances rather than genuine expertise, as if the right consultants could provide the kind of understanding that came only from years of operational experience. Military leaders could distinguish between authentic knowledge and purchased credibility, between advisors who had lived the experience and consultants who had merely studied it. Jake looked at his watch and realized they had been rehashing the morning's disaster for nearly 2 hours without reaching any meaningful conclusions or developing any realistic solutions. Their analysis had devolved into mutual reassurance and external blame casting, avoiding the uncomfortable recognition that their failure had been caused by fundamental gaps in their understanding rather than unfair evaluation criteria. We should probably head down to Pemberton's office, he said reluctantly. Whatever he wants to discuss, delaying it isn't going to make the conversation any more pleasant. As the three executives prepared to leave the break room, None of them noticed the quiet figure, who had been methodically cleaning the adjacent conference room for the past hour. Maria Santos had heard every word of their post-mortem discussion. Their complaints about unfair treatment and operational experience requirements. She had listened to their plans for hiring consultants with special forces backgrounds and their bewilderment at military leaders who prioritized substance over presentation. From her position near the conference room's open doorway, Maria had observed the entire breakdown with the detached professionalism of someone who understood exactly what the executives had failed to grasp. She had seen this pattern countless times before, in briefing rooms and command centers where civilian contractors had promised capabilities they couldn't deliver and understanding they didn't possess. The morning's presentation had unfolded exactly as she had expected from the moment she learned about the military delegation's visit. As Jake, Linda, and David filed out of the break room toward their appointment with corporate consequences, Maria continued her methodical cleaning with the same quiet efficiency she brought to all her tasks. But something in her bearing had shifted during the afternoon's eavesdropping session. The patience that had seemed infinite now carried an edge of anticipation, as if she were waiting for something specific to occur. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tomorrow would bring new humiliations and new demonstrations of the gap between corporate arrogance and military reality. But tomorrow would also bring opportunities for truth to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for 18 months. The executives who had spent the afternoon lamenting their unfair treatment by military leaders were about to discover what real military expertise looked like when it finally decided to reveal itself. The building's ventilation system hummed its familiar tune, carrying the scent of cleaning solutions and the lingering aroma of expensive coffee through corridors that would soon witness revelations nobody could have anticipated. The early morning mist clung to downtown Denver like a shroud, transforming the familiar skyline into something ethereal and uncertain. At 0545 hours, the city was still awakening, with only the most dedicated commuters and night shift workers moving through streets that would soon pulse with rush hour traffic. The Meridian Defense Building stood silhouetted against the gray sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting nothing but the promise of another day in corporate America's endless pursuit of profit and prestige. Inside the building's employee break room, the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical symphony over furniture that had seen better years and coffee machines that dispensed liquid optimism to people who needed artificial energy to face their daily responsibilities. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and accumulated hopes, the kind of space where working-class dreams went to be tempered by reality and where conversations about better tomorrows competed with the immediate demands of today's survival. Maria Santos sat alone at a corner table, her standard-issue lunchbox open before her, and a thermos of coffee cooling in the morning air. Her breakfast was simple and practical: a sandwich made with day-old bread and discount lunch meat, an apple that had seen better days, and a small container of yogurt that represented a minor luxury in her carefully managed budget. She ate methodically, without hurry or waste, her dark eyes focused on the morning newspaper that someone had left behind after the previous shift. The newspaper's front page carried the usual mixture of political posturing and economic uncertainty. Stories about budget deficits and international tensions that seemed remote from the daily reality of cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans. But buried in the business section was a small article about defense contracting trends, complete with quotes from Pentagon officials about the importance of operational experience in procurement decisions. Maria read it with the kind of attention that most people reserved for their horoscopes. Though her interest was far more professional than casual, she had arrived an hour early for her shift, partly because the bus schedule didn't align perfectly with her work hours and partly because she had learned to value the quiet time before her colleagues arrived with their daily load of accumulated resentments and casual cruelties. The building was different in the early morning hours, peaceful in a way that disappeared once the executive floors filled with people who measured their worth in stock options and parking space. Assignments. At precisely 0630, the break room door opened to admit Carlos Mendez, a security guard whose night shift was ending just as Maria's day was beginning. Carlos was 62 years old and had worked security at various corporate buildings for the better part of 2 decades, accumulating wisdom about human nature that came from watching people when they thought nobody was observing them. His uniform was pressed despite the long night, and his bearing carried the dignified professionalism of someone who took pride in doing honest work well. "Morning, Maria," Carlos said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine respect rather than the patronizing friendliness that characterized most interactions between building staff and management. "How's the family treating you these days?" It was their standard greeting, a running joke that acknowledged Maria's isolation from the corporate culture that surrounded her daily existence. Carlos was one of the few people in the building who seemed to recognize her humanity rather than simply her function, and their brief morning conversations had become a welcome constant in her otherwise solitary routine. "Same as always," Maria replied, her slight smile suggesting appreciation for Carlos's consistent kindness. "How was your night? Anything interesting happen while the important people were safely home in their beds?" Carlos poured himself coffee from the machine and settled into the chair across from her, his movements carrying the careful precision of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of wear. His dark eyes held the kind of depth that came from years of watching other people's dramas unfold while maintaining professional distance from their consequences. "Quiet night mostly," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the methodical attention of someone who had perfected this routine through countless repetitions. "Though I did notice something unusual around midnight. Couple of the executive assistants came in to do some late-night damage control. Looked like they were trying to salvage something that had gone very wrong during business hours." Maria's interest sharpened slightly, though she maintained the same neutral expression that had served her well throughout 18 months of invisibility. She had heard fragments of conversation during yesterday's cleaning rounds, enough to understand that the military presentation had been a disaster of epic proportions. But Carlos's security perspective might provide additional details that hadn't filtered down to the service staff level. "Military contract presentation didn't go well, I'm guessing," she said, her tone carefully casual despite her genuine curiosity about the specific nature of their failure. Carlos nodded, his expression suggesting he had observed the aftermath with the kind of professional detachment that security guards developed after years of witnessing corporate meltdowns. "Heard some shouting from Pemberton's office around 9 p.m., then saw Jake Morrison leaving the building like his hair was on fire. Linda Rodriguez looked like she'd been crying, though she was trying to hide it behind those designer sunglasses." The image of Linda Rodriguez attempting to conceal emotional devastation behind luxury accessories carried a particular irony that wasn't lost on Maria, the same woman who had spent months demonstrating her superiority over service staff had been reduced to tears by people who actually understood the difference between corporate theater and professional competence. "David Chen was the most interesting one," Carlos continued, lowering his voice as if sharing classified intelligence. "Spent 20 minutes on the phone in the parking garage, pacing around his BMW like a caged animal. From what I could overhear, he was trying to call in favors from his Pentagon connections, but nobody was taking his calls." Maria absorbed this information with the same quiet attention she brought to everything else, filing away details that painted a picture of complete professional collapse among people who had built their careers on the assumption that confidence could substitute for competence. Their failure hadn't just been disappointing. It had been personally devastating in ways that suggested they had finally encountered evaluation criteria they couldn't manipulate or circumvent. Think they'll recover from it? She asked, though. Her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Carlos's laugh was dry but not unkind. In my experience, people like that always find ways to blame their failures on external factors. Give them a week, and they'll have convinced themselves that the military delegation was biased or uninformed or operating under hidden agendas. They're not the type to engage in serious self-reflection. His assessment aligned perfectly with Maria's own observations about corporate culture and the psychology of people who had never been held accountable for the real-world consequences of their decisions. The executives who had spent months preparing their presentation had approached it like a sales pitch rather than a professional evaluation, and their failure stemmed from fundamental misunderstandings about what military leaders valued and prioritized. The break room door opened again to admit Jennifer Walsh, a maintenance supervisor whose early arrival usually signaled some kind of scheduling crisis or equipment failure that would complicate everyone's day. Jennifer was 48 years old and had worked her way up from entry-level positions through a combination of technical competence and political awareness, understanding both how buildings functioned and how corporate hierarchies operated. "Maria, glad you're here early," Jennifer said, her expression carrying the kind of focused urgency that suggested impending complications. "We've got a situation developing on the executive floors. Apparently, there's going to be some kind of emergency board meeting this afternoon, and they want the entire building deep cleaned before the members arrive." The request was typical of corporate crisis management, where cosmetic improvements were implemented to create the illusion of control when substantive problems couldn't be immediately addressed. Maria understood that the building's cleanliness had nothing to do with the company's fundamental inability to deliver on their promises, but appearances mattered in corporate environments where perception often carried more weight than performance. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Maria asked, already mentally calculating the additional work required to meet enhanced cleaning standards across multiple floors. Jennifer consulted her clipboard with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested she was delivering bad news, that she had been ordered to present as reasonable requests. "They want everything completed by 2 p.m., conference rooms, executive offices, break areas, even the bathroom fixtures need to be spotless. Apparently, some of the board members are flying in from out of state specifically for this meeting." Carlos finished his coffee and stood to leave, his night shift officially ending with the arrival of day personnel. "Sounds like they're preparing for either a major announcement or a major funeral," he said, his tone suggesting he suspected the latter was more likely than the former. "Emergency board meetings don't usually happen unless someone's getting fired or the company's in serious financial trouble," Jennifer agreed, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had witnessed multiple corporate crises. During her career. After Carlos left for his drive home, Maria and Jennifer spent several minutes coordinating the enhanced cleaning schedule and identifying which areas would require the most attention. The executive floors needed to project an image of success and competence that would reassure board members about the company's continued viability, despite yesterday's demonstration that success and competence were exactly what Meridian Defense lacked. "One more thing," Jennifer said as she prepared to return to her office. "Management specifically requested that all service staff maintain low profiles during the board meeting. They don't want any distractions or interruptions while important discussions are taking place." The instruction was typical of corporate events where working-class employees were expected to become invisible, so that executives could conduct their business without being reminded of the human infrastructure that made their operations possible. Maria nodded her understanding, though she found it ironic that the same people who depended on her labor for their daily comfort were so concerned about her presence during their moment of crisis. As Jennifer left the break room, Maria remained seated at the corner table, finishing her simple breakfast while contemplating the day ahead. The enhanced cleaning requirements would keep her busy throughout the morning and early afternoon, moving through the executive floors with even more systematic precision than usual. She would be present but invisible, observing but unobserved, listening to conversations that revealed the true extent of Meridian Defense's predicament. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. While company executives scrambled to manage the fallout from their encounter with actual military professionals, the building's most qualified expert on military operations would be emptying their trash cans and cleaning their windows. While they struggled to understand why their presentation had failed so spectacularly, someone who could have explained their mistakes in precise detail would be mopping their floors and restocking their supply cabinets at 0700 hours exactly. Maria gathered her cleaning supplies and began her methodical progression through the building's service areas. Her cart was loaded with the tools of invisibility, industrial cleaners that left no trace of their application, microfiber cloths that removed fingerprints without leaving new ones, vacuum attachments that could clean around furniture without disturbing carefully arranged papers or personal items. As she worked, fragments of conversation drifted from offices and conference rooms, where the previous day's disaster was being analyzed and dissected by people who lacked the expertise to understand what had actually occurred. She heard Jake Morrison complaining about unfair evaluation criteria. She overheard Linda Rodriguez planning a damage control campaign that would reframe their failure as a learning experience. She listened to David Chen developing conspiracy theories about military bias against civilian contractors. None of them understood that their failure had been inevitable from the moment they decided to approach military procurement as a sales challenge rather than a professional evaluation. None of them recognized that their lack of operational experience wasn't a minor qualification gap, but a fundamental disqualification from serious consideration. None of them could comprehend that military leaders evaluated contractors based on their ability to provide equipment that would function reliably when lives depended on it. But Maria understood all of this with the clarity that came from years of experience in environments where theoretical knowledge was worthless and practical competence was the only currency that mattered. As she moved through the executive floors with systematic precision, she carried with her the kind of expertise that Meridian Defense's leadership could only dream of possessing. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had shrouded the city at dawn. Inside the building, corporate executives continued their frantic efforts to salvage something from the wreckage of their professional credibility. And in the corridors between their offices, a woman they had dismissed and degraded quietly performed the work that kept their world functioning, while possessing knowledge that could have transformed their understanding of everything they thought they knew about military service and professional excellence. The reckoning was coming. Though none of them suspected, it would arrive wearing a janitor's uniform and carrying secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for 18 months. The emergency board meeting convened at precisely 1400 hours in Meridian Defense's most prestigious conference room, a space designed to project power and success through carefully orchestrated displays of corporate wealth. 12 board members had assembled around the custom mahogany table, their expressions ranging from mild concern to barely contained fury as they reviewed preliminary reports about the failed Pentagon presentation. These were individuals who had built fortunes through strategic investments and calculated risks, people who understood that reputation was more valuable than revenue, and that lost credibility could destroy decades of careful relationship building. Chairman William Sterling sat at the head of the table, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting the kind of understated authority that came from 40 years of successful business leadership. At 71, he had survived multiple economic downturns and industry consolidations, building his fortune through an intuitive understanding of when to advance and when to retreat. His expression suggested he was currently evaluating which Strategy would be most appropriate for Meridian Defense's current crisis. Richard Pemberton occupied the opposite end of the table, his usual confidence replaced by the desperate energy of someone whose professional survival was being determined by people who held his fate in their hands. The detailed reports spread before the board members contained enough specific criticism from Pentagon sources to make clear that yesterday's presentation hadn't simply been disappointing. It had been a comprehensive demonstration of the company's fundamental inadequacy for serious military contracting. The preliminary feedback from General Hawkins was unambiguous. Sterling said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She specifically questioned our technical competence, our understanding of operational requirements, and our overall suitability for defense contracts involving critical military communications. Board member Margaret Chen, a former Defense Department procurement officer who had joined Meridian's board specifically to provide insider knowledge of military contracting, consulted her tablet with obvious displeasure. Her experience in Pentagon procurement had taught her to recognize the warning signs of contractor failure, and yesterday's feedback contained every indicator that Meridian Defense had been permanently marked as unsuitable for serious consideration. General Rodriguez's assessment was even more damaging, she reported, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the long-term implications of military leadership criticism. He characterized our presentation as amateurish and suggested that our lack of operational experience made us unsuitable for projects involving soldier safety. The word amateurish resonated through the conference room like a death knell, particularly devastating because it came from military leaders whose approval was essential for the company's continued viability in the defense sector. In the corporate world, criticism could be managed through public relations campaigns and strategic messaging. In the military world, reputation was earned through demonstrated competence and lost through proven inadequacy, with few opportunities for rehabilitation. Once credibility had been destroyed. James Morrison, Jake's uncle and the board member who had originally championed his nephew's rapid promotion within the company, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he contemplated the implications of family connections to professional failure. Perhaps we're being too hasty in our assessment. Military procurement can be unpredictable, and there may be factors beyond our control that influence their evaluation. His attempt to minimize the significance of the feedback was met with the kind of polite silence that indicated his colleagues weren't prepared to engage in wishful thinking about the company's prospects. The board members had built their success through realistic assessment of business conditions rather than optimistic interpretation of negative data, and the Pentagon's criticism was too specific and detailed to be dismissed as unfair evaluation. Sterling consulted his notes, reviewing specific quotes from military sources that painted a devastating picture of Meridian's presentation. Colonel Mitchell's technical assessment was particularly concerning. She identified multiple gaps in our understanding of electronic warfare capabilities and questioned whether our engineering team had ever worked with actual military communication systems under combat conditions. The criticism struck at the heart of Meridian's business model, which depended on the assumption that civilian technical expertise could be adapted to military requirements without deep understanding of operational environments. The company had built its reputation through successful completion of relatively simple contracts, but their attempt to compete for advanced communication systems had exposed fundamental limitations in their capabilities and knowledge base. Board member Patricia Williams, whose background in corporate crisis management had been valuable during previous challenges, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone developing damage control strategies. What are our options for recovering from this situation? Can we request a second presentation opportunity, or perhaps engage different Pentagon contacts who might be more receptive to our capabilities? Her questions revealed the corporate mindset that assumed setbacks could be overcome through better marketing or alternative approaches. But Margaret Chen's expression suggested that military procurement operated according to different rules than civilian business development. Once military leaders had reached conclusions about contractor competence, those assessments became part of permanent records that influenced future procurement decisions across the entire defense establishment. In my experience, Margaret said, carefully, military evaluations are based on demonstrated capability rather than potential for improvement. The Pentagon doesn't provide second chances to contractors who have already proven their inadequacy during formal presentations. Pemberton made a desperate attempt to shift responsibility away from his leadership and toward external factors beyond the company's control. The evaluation criteria seemed to emphasize operational experience over technical innovation. How were we supposed to anticipate that they would prioritize military service over engineering excellence? His protest revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to yesterday's disaster. Pemberton and his team had approached military procurement as if it were similar to civilian business development, where persuasive presentations and impressive specifications could overcome questions about practical experience. They had failed to recognize that military leaders evaluated contractors based on their ability to provide equipment that would function reliably when soldiers' lives depended on it. Sterling's expression suggested he had little patience for explanations that avoided acknowledging management responsibility for the company's failures. Richard, the Pentagon's emphasis on operational experience wasn't hidden or unexpected. Military procurement has always prioritized proven capability over theoretical innovation. The observation hung in the air like an indictment, highlighting the extent to which Meridian's leadership had misunderstood their target market and evaluation criteria. Board members who had invested millions in the company's expansion into advanced military contracts were beginning to understand that their investments had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about what the Pentagon valued and prioritized. Board member Thomas Rodriguez, whose background in engineering provided technical perspective on the company's capabilities, reviewed the specific criticisms that had been leveled against Meridian's communication systems. The technical feedback suggests that our design team lacks understanding of how their equipment would perform under actual combat conditions. That's not a training issue or a presentation problem. That's a fundamental competency gap. His assessment was particularly damaging because it came from someone with the technical expertise to evaluate the Pentagon's criticism objectively. If Meridian's communication systems were genuinely inadequate for military applications, then the company's entire strategic direction had been based on capabilities they didn't actually possess. Margaret Chen consulted her tablet again, reviewing additional feedback that painted an even grimmer picture of the company's prospects. There's more. General Hawkins specifically mentioned that she would be sharing her assessment with other military leaders involved in similar procurement decisions. Our reputation within the Pentagon is now actively negative rather than simply unknown. The revelation that Meridian's failure would be communicated throughout the military establishment represented a catastrophic expansion of the damage beyond the single contract they had lost. Military leaders maintained informal networks that shared information about contractor performance, meaning that yesterday's presentation would influence procurement decisions across multiple departments and agencies. Sterling looked around the table, reading the expressions of board members who were beginning to understand the full scope of the crisis facing the company. The question before us is whether Meridian Defense can recover from this reputational damage, or whether we need to consider more fundamental changes to our business strategy. The euphemism "fundamental changes" carried implications that everyone in the room understood, but nobody wanted to articulate directly. In corporate language, fundamental changes often meant leadership restructuring, strategic pivots, or complete abandonment of business lines that had proven unviable. For Pemberton, it meant the potential end of his career as CEO and the destruction of everything he had built over 15 years of aggressive expansion. James Morrison made one final attempt to defend his nephew's role in the presentation disaster. Perhaps the problem wasn't with our capabilities, but with how they were presented. Jake has extensive experience in defense contracting, and his technical knowledge is comprehensive. His defense was met with the kind of uncomfortable silence that indicated his colleagues weren't prepared to engage in family loyalty discussions when the company's survival was at stake. Several board members had reviewed detailed accounts of Jake's performance during the presentation, and those accounts suggested that his lack of operational experience had been painfully obvious to military leaders, who could distinguish between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Patricia Williams shifted the conversation toward concrete action rather than continued analysis of past failures. What immediate steps can we take to minimize further damage? Do we need to consider replacing the management team responsible for yesterday's presentation? Her question addressed the elephant in the room that everyone had been avoiding, though. The implication was clear enough that Pemberton's face went pale as he contemplated the possibility of being held personally accountable for the company's failure. Board members who had previously supported his leadership were beginning to question whether his civilian background and corporate experience were adequate for competing in the military contracting sector. Sterling consulted his watch, noting that they had been discussing the crisis for over an hour without identifying any viable solutions or recovery strategies. The longer their deliberations continued, the more apparent it became that Meridian Defense faced systemic problems that couldn't be addressed through minor adjustments or cosmetic changes. I think we need to acknowledge that our current approach to military contracting has proven fundamentally flawed, he said, his tone carrying the finality of someone who had reached an irreversible conclusion. The question is whether we can develop genuine military expertise quickly enough to salvage our reputation, or whether we should focus our resources on civilian markets where our capabilities are better matched to client requirements. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Outside the conference room, Maria Santos continued her methodical cleaning of the executive floors, her presence so routine that the board members hadn't bothered to ensure their private discussion remained truly private. Through the partially open door, she had heard every word of their crisis analysis, every admission of inadequacy, every desperate attempt to avoid acknowledging the fundamental truth that they lacked the expertise necessary to serve military clients effectively. As she worked, Maria reflected on the irony of the situation unfolding just meters away. While highly paid executives struggled to understand why their presentation had failed so completely, the building's most qualified military expert was emptying their trash cans and cleaning their windows. While they debated whether to hire consultants with operational experience, someone with more operational experience than anyone in the room was mopping their floors and restocking their supply cabinets. The board meeting continued for another 30 minutes. But Maria had heard enough to understand that Meridian Defense was facing an existential crisis that would likely result in significant leadership changes and strategic restructuring. The company that had employed her for 18 months while treating her with casual contempt was discovering that success in military contracting required exactly the kind of expertise they had dismissed as irrelevant to their corporate objectives. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and new opportunities for truth to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden. The executives who were currently debating their company's survival had no idea that the solution to their problems had been working among them for over a year, invisible and unrecognized, but possessing exactly the kind of operational credibility that military leaders valued above all other qualifications. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only September in Denver could provide, the air carrying hints of autumn and the promise of change that seemed to permeate everything. From the changing leaves to the shifting dynamics within Meridian Defense Consulting. By 0800 hours, Word had spread throughout the building that heads would roll following yesterday's board meeting, though nobody knew exactly whose careers would be sacrificed to appease investors and restore corporate credibility. Jake Morrison arrived at his office to find a message waiting on his desk that his stomach had been dreading since the moment General Hawkins had walked out of their disastrous presentation. The company letterhead felt heavier than usual in his hands, and the formal language couldn't disguise the fact that his employment was being terminated effective immediately. 18 months of rapid promotion and corporate success had evaporated in the span of a single morning, destroyed by military leaders who valued substance over style and competence over connections. Linda Rodriguez received similar notification through the company's Human Resources Department, delivered with the kind of clinical efficiency that corporations use to minimize legal exposure while maximizing psychological impact. Her carefully constructed career in event management and corporate communications had been reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing presentation skills with actual expertise. The executives who had once praised her attention to detail were now eager to distance themselves from her association with the company's most public failure. David Chen's dismissal came with additional complications, as his civilian Pentagon connections had become liabilities rather than assets, following his demonstration of complete ignorance about military procurement priorities. The people he had name-dropped during networking events were now actively avoiding association with someone whose lack of genuine understanding had been exposed in such spectacular fashion. His reputation within the defense contracting community was permanently damaged, regardless of where his next employment opportunity might emerge. The three former executives gathered their personal belongings with the shell-shocked expressions of people who had discovered that corporate success was far more fragile than they had imagined. Their colleagues watched the proceedings with mixture of sympathy and relief, understanding that someone had to be held accountable for the company's humiliation, while grateful that the responsibility had fallen on others. The building's atmosphere carried the tension of an organization in crisis, where survival instincts override collegial loyalty and self-preservation becomes the primary consideration. Richard Pemberton had managed to retain his position as CEO, but only through agreeing to a complete restructuring of the company's military contracting division and accepting direct board oversight of all future Pentagon-related activities. His survival came at the cost of admitting that his leadership had been inadequate and his strategic vision fundamentally flawed, concessions that would shadow every decision he made going forward. The board's confidence in his abilities had been shattered beyond repair, though they were willing to allow him the opportunity to demonstrate whether he could learn from his failures. Margaret Chen, the board member with Defense Department experience, had been appointed to lead a comprehensive review of Meridian's military contracting capabilities and develop recommendations for either rehabilitation or abandonment of that business line. Her first task was to conduct a complete assessment of the company's personnel, identifying who possessed genuine military expertise and who had been masquerading as qualified through corporate networking and superficial credentials. The review process began immediately, with Margaret scheduling individual interviews with every employee who had any connection to military projects or defense-related activities. Her approach was methodical and thorough, designed to separate authentic expertise from manufactured credentials and identify the human resources that might salvage something from the wreckage of the company's reputation. She understood that military leaders respected proven competence above all other qualifications, and her review would focus on finding evidence of such competence within Meridian's existing workforce. Maria Santos received notification of her interview appointment through the building's internal messaging system, a development that surprised her because service staff were rarely included in management reviews or strategic planning processes. The appointment was scheduled for 1400 hours in Margaret Chen's temporary office on the 20th floor, a space that had been hastily established following the previous day's board meeting and the subsequent personnel changes. The notification included a request that Maria bring any documentation related to her background and qualifications, phrasing that seemed unnecessarily formal for someone whose primary responsibility was maintaining cleanliness in corporate environments. Most janitors possessed high school diplomas and perhaps some vocational training, but rarely maintained comprehensive documentation of their educational and professional histories. The request suggested that Margaret's review would be more thorough than typical human resources procedures. Maria spent her lunch break reviewing documents that she had kept in a safety deposit box across town, materials that she hadn't examined for over 2 years because they represented a life she had deliberately left behind. The folder contained service records, commendation letters, training certificates, and performance evaluations that painted a picture of military excellence that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Each document was a reminder of missions completed and responsibilities fulfilled, of trust earned and respect commanded in environments where both were precious commodities. The Medal of Honor citation was folded carefully between protective plastic sheets, its formal language inadequate to convey the chaos and terror of the night, when she had repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to coordinate the evacuation of wounded soldiers from an overrun forward operating base. The Silver Star recommendations told stories of tactical brilliance under impossible pressure, of split-second decisions that had saved lives and completed missions that others had deemed impossible. The Purple Heart documentation recorded wounds sustained during operations that officially never happened, treated in medical facilities that didn't appear on any government organizational charts, but it was the letter from General Patricia Hawkins that carried the most weight, written 3 years earlier when Hawkins had commanded the task force that included Maria's Special Operations Unit. The letter recommended Maria for promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon Special Operations Planning Staff, describing her as the most tactically proficient and operationally effective officer I have had the privilege to command. It was signed with the kind of personal endorsement that general officers reserved for subordinates they considered truly exceptional. Maria had declined the promotion and requested discharge instead, her decision motivated by accumulated trauma and exhaustion that had made continued service impossible despite her demonstrated excellence. The transition to civilian life had been difficult, complicated by health issues related to her service and a job market that struggled to translate special operations experience into civilian employment opportunities. Cleaning services had provided income and anonymity, allowing her to disappear into the vast population of working people whose contributions went unrecognized but whose labor was essential to society's functioning. At precisely 1400 hours, Maria knocked on the door of Margaret Chen's temporary office, her appearance exactly what would be expected from someone who spent her days maintaining corporate cleanliness. Her uniform was pressed and professional, her demeanor respectful but not subservient, and her posture carried the unconscious bearing of someone who had learned to project competence, regardless of circumstances. She carried a simple folder containing copies of her service documentation, though she had left the most sensitive materials in the safety deposit box. Margaret looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who had been conducting similar interviews all morning, and expected this one to follow the same routine pattern. Her experience in Defense Department procurement had taught her to recognize various types of military experience, from administrative support to combat operations, and she had developed an instinct for distinguishing between genuine service and exaggerated claims about military connection. "Miss Santos," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, "thank you for coming. I'm reviewing all personnel as part of our assessment of company capabilities, and I wanted to discuss your background and experience." Maria took the offered seat and placed her folder on the desk, her movements economical and precise in ways that most people wouldn't notice, but that caught Margaret's attention immediately. There was something about Maria's bearing that didn't quite match her current employment, a quality of controlled alertness that suggested familiarity with environments where situational awareness was critical to survival. "I understand you've been with the company for 18 months, Margaret continued, consulting her notes. "Your supervisor reports that your work quality is exceptional and that you've never had any performance issues or disciplinary problems." Assessment was accurate, but incomplete, focusing on Maria's reliability and professionalism, while missing the deeper qualities that made her exceptional at any task she undertook. Margaret's procurement background had taught her to look beyond surface qualifications for indicators of deeper competence, and Maria's consistent excellence in a menial position suggested capabilities that exceeded her current role's requirements. "Before joining Meridian, what was your employment history?" Margaret asked, beginning the standard interview process that she had used with dozens of other employees throughout the morning. Maria opened her folder and extracted a single document, placing it carefully on the desk where Margaret could read it clearly. The DD-214 discharge form contained basic information about military service dates and final rank, but the details immediately caught Margaret's attention. The service dates indicated over 12 years of active duty, and the final rank of captain suggested significant responsibility and proven leadership ability. Margaret's expression changed as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. Military officers who left service at the rank of captain had typically commanded companies of soldiers and managed complex operations under challenging conditions. The transition from military leadership to civilian janitorial work represented a dramatic career change that raised questions about circumstances and motivations. "You were a commissioned officer," Margaret said, her tone shifting from routine inquiry to genuine interest. "What was your military occupational specialty?" Maria extracted another document from her folder, this one containing her final performance evaluation and assignment history. The pages revealed a progression through increasingly responsible positions within Special Operations units, culminating in assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment as a tactical operations officer. Margaret's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of that assignment, understanding that few officers earned positions within the military's most elite aviation units. "Night Stalkers," Margaret said quietly, using the 160th's unofficial designation. "You served with the 160th SOAR." The recognition in Margaret's voice indicated her understanding of what that assignment represented. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment was legendary within military circles for conducting the most dangerous and sensitive missions in America's arsenal. From the raid that killed Osama bin Laden to countless classified operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Officers assigned to the 160th were selected for exceptional competence and unshakable reliability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Maria nodded once, her expression remaining neutral despite the significance of Margaret's recognition. "I served as tactical operations officer for 3 years before requesting discharge." Margaret leaned forward, her interest now completely focused on understanding how someone with Maria's background had ended up cleaning offices for executives who possessed a fraction of her qualifications. "May I ask what prompted your decision to leave military service?" The question touched on sensitive territory that Maria had spent 2 years learning to navigate in civilian conversations. The truth involved classified operations, accumulated trauma, and health issues related to her service, but those details couldn't be shared with someone who lacked appropriate security clearances. Her response had to provide enough information to satisfy legitimate curiosity while protecting operational security and personal privacy. "Medical retirement," Maria said simply, offering the abbreviated explanation that covered multiple complex factors without requiring detailed elaboration. Margaret's expression suggested she understood that medical retirement could encompass everything from physical injuries to psychological trauma, and that veterans often preferred not to elaborate on the specific circumstances that ended their military careers. Her procurement background had taught her to respect the privacy of service members, while gathering enough information to assess their qualifications for specific roles. Your service record indicates extensive experience with military communication systems, Margaret observed, reviewing the documents Maria had provided. Tactical operations officers in special operations units typically coordinate complex missions requiring secure communication across multiple agencies and units. The observation was accurate and significant, highlighting exactly the kind of expertise that Meridian Defense had desperately needed during their disastrous presentation to Pentagon leaders. Maria's actual experience with military communication systems under combat conditions represented precisely what General Hawkins and her colleagues had found missing from the company's technical team. Maria extracted the final document from her folder, this one containing her training history and professional development record. The pages revealed completion of advanced courses in electronic warfare, tactical communications, and joint operations planning. Credentials that represented years of intensive education and practical application in operational environments. Margaret studied the documentation with growing amazement, recognizing that she was looking at qualifications that surpassed anything possessed by the executives who had just been terminated for their incompetence. Maria's training record read like a blueprint for exactly the kind of expertise that military procurement officers valued when evaluating contractor capabilities. "Miss Santos," Margaret said carefully, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and bewilderment, "you possess qualifications that would make you invaluable to any defense contractor. Why have you been working as custodial staff?" The question that had been building throughout their conversation finally emerged, though Margaret's tone suggested she suspected the answer involved circumstances beyond simple career choice. Maria's transition from military leadership to civilian service work represented the kind of dramatic change that usually resulted from factors outside individual control. Maria's response was quiet but direct, carrying the weight of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while. Sometimes the transition from military to civilian life takes longer than expected. Sometimes honest work is more important than prestigious employment. Her answer contained layers of meaning that Margaret could sense, but not fully comprehend without additional context. The reference to disappearing suggested circumstances that required anonymity, while the emphasis on honest work implied pride in doing any job well, regardless of its status within social hierarchies. Margaret sat back in her chair, processing the implications of what she had discovered. While Meridian Defense's executives had been scrambling to understand why their presentation had failed, the most qualified person in the building had been quietly performing essential but unrecognized work. While they had debated hiring consultants with military experience, someone with more relevant experience than anyone they could have hired had been emptying their trash cans and cleaning their windows. The irony was staggering, but it also represented an opportunity that could transform Meridian Defense's prospects if handled properly. Margaret understood that military leaders like General Hawkins would immediately recognize and respect Maria's qualifications, potentially providing the credibility that the company desperately needed to rehabilitate its reputation within the Pentagon. But she also understood that convincing someone who had chosen anonymity to step forward and claim recognition would require careful consideration of Maria's motivations and circumstances. The conversation had revealed someone who valued substance over status and service over recognition, qualities that would need to be respected and protected during any transition to a more prominent role within the company. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Margaret carefully exploring Maria's background and motivations while respecting the boundaries that had been established around sensitive topics. By the end of their conversation, she had gained enough information to understand that Meridian Defense had been unknowingly employing someone whose qualifications could revolutionize their approach to military contracting. If Maria could be convinced to emerge from the shadows where she had been hiding, the following Monday morning brought an atmosphere of electric anticipation to Meridian Defense Consulting, the kind of charged energy that preceded either triumph or disaster with equal intensity. Word had spread throughout the building over the weekend that Margaret Chen had discovered something extraordinary during her personnel review, though the specific details remained classified at the executive level. Employees arriving for work found themselves caught between curiosity and apprehension, understanding that whatever had been discovered would fundamentally change the company's trajectory. Richard Pemberton had spent the weekend in emergency consultations with board members and Pentagon contacts, trying to arrange what Margaret Chen had described as a unique opportunity to demonstrate authentic military expertise to the same delegation that had previously rejected our capabilities. The request had been so unusual and the timing so compressed that several military leaders had initially refused to consider returning to Meridian Defense for any reason. Only Margaret's personal reputation and carefully worded explanations had convinced them to grant one final audience. General Patricia Hawkins arrived at Meridian Defense at precisely 900 hours, her expression carrying the skeptical patience of someone who had agreed to this meeting as a professional courtesy rather than genuine expectation of discovering anything worthwhile. She was accompanied by General Marcus Rodriguez and Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the same delegation that had witnessed the company's spectacular failure just 1 week earlier. Their willingness to return represented an extraordinary opportunity that would not be repeated if this second encounter proved equally disappointing. The executive conference room had been reconfigured for this meeting with the elaborate presentation equipment removed in favor of a simple table and chairs arrangement that suggested conversation rather than performance. Margaret Chen had specifically requested this modification, understanding that military leaders would be more receptive to authentic discussion than corporate theater. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast everything in sharp relief, eliminating shadows where inadequate preparation might hide. Margaret stood at the head of the table, her bearing projecting the confident authority of someone who had spent years navigating Pentagon politics and military procurement processes. Behind her calm exterior, she carried the weight of understanding that this meeting would determine whether Meridian Defense could salvage its reputation or would be permanently relegated to minor contracts that didn't require serious military credibility. "Generals, Colonel," Margaret began, her voice carrying the respect due to military leaders while maintaining the professional dignity of someone who had earned her own place at this table. "Thank you for agreeing to return to Meridian Defense. I know your previous experience here was disappointing, and I appreciate your willingness to give us this opportunity to demonstrate that our capabilities extend beyond what was presented last week." General Hawkins leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. Her body language suggested she was prepared to listen, but would require substantial evidence before revising her assessment of Meridian's qualifications. The company's previous presentation had been so fundamentally flawed that recovering from that initial impression would require extraordinary demonstration of competence. "Ms. Chen," General Hawkins replied, her tone professional but reserved, "our evaluation last week was comprehensive and our conclusions were based on clear evidence of inadequate expertise. For us to revise that assessment, we would need to see capabilities that fundamentally contradict what we observed during your formal presentation." The challenge was direct and uncompromising, reflecting the military's preference for straightforward communication over diplomatic evasion. Margaret understood that she had perhaps 15 minutes to demonstrate that Meridian Defense possessed genuine military expertise, or this meeting would conclude with even more negative assessment than the previous encounter. "General, I'd like to introduce someone whose qualifications might address your concerns about our operational understanding," Margaret said, turning toward the conference room door. Captain Maria Santos, United States Army, retired. The door opened to reveal Maria Santos, but the transformation from invisible janitor to military professional was so complete that the generals might not have recognized her if they had encountered her during building maintenance duties. She wore a simple business suit that somehow projected more authority than the expensive uniforms favored by corporate executives, and her bearing carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had earned respect through demonstrated competence. Rather than purchased credentials, Maria's appearance immediately caught the attention of every military officer in the room, not because of her civilian clothes, but because of qualities that couldn't be concealed regardless of context. Her posture was perfect without being rigid, her movements economical and precise, and her eyes held the kind of depth that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure. She carried herself with the unconscious authority of someone who had commanded in combat and brought everyone home. General Rodriguez was the first to react, his weathered face showing recognition that transcended their formal introduction. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Maria's bearing and demeanor, cataloging details that triggered memories of classified briefings and operational reports from his years commanding special operations training. Something about her presence felt familiar, though he couldn't immediately place the specific connection. "Captain Santos," General Hawkins said, her tone shifting subtly as she absorbed the implications of Maria's military bearing. "Miss Chen mentioned that you might be able to address our concerns about operational experience. What was your service background?" Maria took the offered seat at the conference table, her movements carrying the same controlled precision that had characterized her work throughout 18 months of invisible employment. When she spoke, her voice held the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in environments where authority was earned rather than assigned. "Ma'am, I served 12 years active duty, including 3 years as Tactical Operations Officer with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment," Maria replied, her response delivered with the concise professionalism that military leaders expected from competent subordinates. The mention of the 160th SOAR caused an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. General Hawkins leaned forward with sharp attention, while General Rodriguez's expression showed the kind of recognition that came from deep familiarity with special operations personnel and their capabilities. Colonel Mitchell consulted her tablet, likely accessing classified databases that would confirm Maria's service record and operational history. "Night Stalkers," General Rodriguez said quietly, using the 160th's unofficial designation with the reverence that special operations personnel reserve for the most elite units. "What was your operational specialty within the regiment?" Maria's response was measured and professional, providing necessary information while respecting classification restrictions that still govern some aspects of her service. "I coordinated tactical operations for deep insertion and extraction missions, primarily in Afghanistan and other classified theaters. My responsibilities included communication planning, electronic warfare coordination, and real-time mission management during complex joint operations." General Hawkins's expression showed the kind of focused attention that suggested she was beginning to understand the significance of what Margaret Chen had discovered. The qualifications Maria was describing represented exactly the kind of operational experience that had been glaringly absent from Meridian's previous presentation, the kind of expertise that military leaders valued above all theoretical knowledge or civilian credentials. "Captain, you mentioned electronic warfare coordination," Colonel Mitchell said, her analytical mind immediately focusing on the technical aspects of Maria's background. "What specific systems and protocols were you familiar with during your service?" Maria's response demonstrated the depth of her technical knowledge in ways that corporate presentations could never achieve. She spoke with precise familiarity about communication encryption protocols, jamming countermeasures, and battlefield coordination systems that represented the cutting edge of military technology. Her explanations were delivered with the casual competence of someone who had used these systems under combat conditions rather than simply studied their specifications. General Rodriguez asked the question that cut to the heart of military leadership. Concerns about contractor capabilities. Captain Santos, based on your operational experience, what are the most critical factors that civilian contractors typically misunderstand about military communication requirements? The question provided Maria with an opportunity to demonstrate her understanding of the gap between corporate assumptions and battlefield realities, the same gap that had doomed Meridian's previous presentation. Her response was thoughtful and comprehensive, addressing technical limitations, operational constraints, and human factors that influenced system effectiveness under combat stress. Sir, the primary misunderstanding involves the difference between laboratory performance and battlefield reliability. Maria began, her explanation drawing from years of experience with equipment that had been designed by people who had never used it under hostile conditions. Civilian contractors often focus on optimal performance specifications without adequately considering how systems degrade under stress, how human factors influence reliability, and how mission requirements can exceed design parameters. Her analysis continued for several minutes, covering topics from electromagnetic interference to user interface design under combat stress. Every point she made was grounded in operational experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and her explanations addressed exactly the concerns that had been raised during Meridian's failed presentation. General Hawkins exchanged glances with her colleagues, their silent communication indicating shared recognition of Maria's exceptional qualifications. The woman sitting across from them possessed the kind of expertise that defense contractors spent years trying to acquire through hiring retired military personnel, but her knowledge was current, comprehensive, and grounded in recent operational experience. Captain, General Hawkins said, her tone carrying new respect and attention, your background is impressive. How long have you been working with Meridian Defense on their military contracts? The question created a moment of tension that highlighted the fundamental irony of the situation. Margaret Chen had discovered that Meridian's most qualified military expert had been employed by the company for 18 months, while being completely excluded from any defense-related activities. The revelation promised to be embarrassing for corporate leadership while demonstrating the kind of institutional blindness that military leaders found particularly troubling. Margaret Chen answered the question with careful diplomacy, understanding that the truth needed to be revealed without unnecessarily damaging the company's credibility. General, Captain Santos has been employed by Meridian Defense for 18 months, but not in a capacity that utilized her military expertise. We discovered her qualifications during our recent personnel review following last week's presentation. The explanation was tactful, but could not conceal the fundamental absurdity of the situation. For 18 months, while Meridian's executives had struggled to understand military requirements and develop credible proposals for Pentagon contracts, someone with extraordinary military expertise had been working in their building in a role that completely ignored her qualifications. General Rodriguez's expression showed the kind of amazement that military leaders reserved for civilian incompetence that exceeded normal expectations. You're telling us that Captain Santos has been employed by your company for a year and a half, and you just discovered that she's qualified to address every concern we raised about your lack of operational expertise? The question was delivered with the dry humor that military officers used when confronting civilian absurdity, but it also contained genuine bewilderment at the level of organizational dysfunction that the revelation represented. Margaret Chen's personnel review had uncovered institutional blindness that bordered on the incredible. That's correct, sir, Margaret replied, maintaining professional composure despite the embarrassing nature of the admission. Our previous management team failed to identify Captain Santos's qualifications, or utilize her expertise in our military contracting efforts. Colonel Mitchell looked up from her tablet, her expression showing the results of her database searches into Maria's service record. Captain Santos, I'm seeing references to classified operations and commendations that suggest your service was particularly distinguished. Without violating security protocols, can you provide any additional context about your operational experience? Maria's response was careful and measured, providing enough information to establish her credibility, while respecting classification requirements that still governed aspects of her service. She mentioned general operation types without specific details, geographic regions without precise locations, and achievements without compromising ongoing security concerns. General Hawkins listened to Maria's summary with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was accessing her own knowledge of classified operations and personnel records. Her expression gradually showed the recognition that came from connecting names with legendary performances, though she maintained professional discretion about whatever specific connections she might be making. Captain Santos, General Hawkins said finally, her tone carrying the weight of someone who had reached important conclusions. Based on our conversation this morning, it appears that Meridian Defense does possess the operational expertise we found lacking during last week's presentation. The question is whether your company is prepared to utilize that expertise appropriately going forward. The statement represented a fundamental shift in the military delegation's assessment of Meridian Defense's capabilities, though it also highlighted the management failures that had prevented those capabilities from being recognized or utilized. Maria's presence had transformed the meeting from damage control to genuine opportunity, but realizing that opportunity would require organizational changes that went far beyond personnel adjustments. Margaret Chen understood that this moment represented either the salvation of Meridian Defense's military contracting aspirations or their final condemnation, depending on how effectively she could demonstrate that the company had learned from its previous failures. The discovery of Maria's qualifications provided an opportunity for redemption, but only if that discovery led to fundamental changes in how the company approached military relationships and operational understanding. The meeting continued for another hour, with Maria answering detailed questions about communication systems, operational requirements, and contractor capabilities that demonstrated her exceptional qualifications for addressing exactly the concerns that had led to Meridian's previous rejection. By the conclusion of their discussion, the military delegation had reached conclusions that would transform everything about how they viewed the company's potential for future defense contracts. But the most significant transformation had occurred in how Maria Santos was perceived within the building, where she had worked invisibly for 18 months, her extraordinary qualifications finally recognized by people who understood their true value and significance. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood in the same conference room where her life had changed forever. But now she wore the uniform of Meridian Defense's newly created Director of Military Operations. The company had secured 3 major Pentagon contracts under her leadership, transforming from industry laughingstock to respected defense partner. Her former tormentors had learned through industry gossip that the janitor they'd bullied possessed a Medal of Honor and personal recommendations from every Special Operations commander in the military. Jake Morrison now worked at a small consulting firm, forever haunted by the knowledge that he had mocked a war hero while she cleaned his office. Linda Rodriguez had left the defense industry entirely, unable to escape the story of how she had humiliated someone whose service record made her own accomplishments look trivial. David Chen discovered that his Pentagon contacts refused his calls once they learned he had supervised the harassment of a decorated veteran. General Hawkins visited Meridian quarterly, not for contract reviews, but to seek Maria's counsel on operational challenges. The building's culture had transformed completely, with employees understanding that excellence could emerge from anywhere, and that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, It was professionally essential. Maria kept a small framed photo on her new desk, her old janitor's cart next to her Medal of Honor citation. It reminded her daily that honor wasn't about recognition, it was about service. Regardless of uniform or title, the greatest victories often come disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things in silence. What hidden talents might the people around you possess? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of courage, resilience, and unexpected heroes. Hit that notification bell. You never know when the next extraordinary story will inspire you to see the world differently. Thank you for watching, and remember, everyone has a story worth knowing.